It had been 400 years since God had spoken directly to the Israelites. Then, one day, God sent an angel to a girl named Mary, who was engaged to a man named Joseph. The angel told Mary that she would soon become pregnant and give birth to a son named Jesus. God would give him the throne of his ancestor David, and his kingdom would never end. But Mary was a virgin, and this confused her. So the angel told her it would be by God's power that she became pregnant. When Mary's fiancé Joseph heard about this, he decided he would quietly end the engagement. But an angel visited Joseph as well, telling him not to be afraid, and that Jesus would save people from their sins. So Joseph and Mary decided to get married. Soon after, they traveled to the town of Bethlehem. Because so many other people were in town, there was no place for them to stay. While they were there, Mary gave birth to her son, wrapped him in cloths, and laid him in the manger. There were shepherds living in the fields nearby. While they were watching their sheep, an angel appeared to them, announcing that a boy had been born in Bethlehem. This boy, said the angel, was the Messiah, the king that the Israelites had been waiting for. So the shepherds left their sheep and raced to Bethlehem, finding Mary and Joseph and Jesus. The shepherds praised God for their new king. During this time, the country of Rome controlled all of Israel. After hearing about Jesus' birth, a group of magicians and astrologers came to Herod, a governor working for the Roman Empire. They claimed that they had seen a star in the sky, telling them that the king of the Israelites, now called Jews, had been born. This news really upset Herod. When they arrived in Bethlehem and met Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, they felt great joy. Herod was furious and commanded that all boys in Bethlehem who were 2 years old and younger be killed. But God had already warned Joseph, who by that time had moved his family to Egypt to hide. Later, after King Herod died, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus moved back to Israel, to a small town named Nazareth. They stayed in Nazareth for years, raising Jesus. When he was 12, they traveled to Jerusalem for a festival. When the festival ended, Joseph and Mary left for home with a large group of people, but Jesus stayed behind without them knowing. When they realized he was missing, they went back to Jerusalem and found Jesus sitting in the temple, listening to the teachers and asking them questions. His parents were upset and couldn't understand why he had stayed behind. Jesus told them, "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" Joseph and Mary didn't know what he meant. They did not yet fully understand the importance of who Jesus was and all he would do.
Well, good morning. That was a really awesome video. I liked the story that it told, but I kind of thought that maybe you needed to hear kind of what happened on that first Christmas from somebody who was actually there. So I'm going to tell you my story. My name is Joseph Davidson, but you can call me Joe. Many of you probably already know me. Some of you might have heard of me. I've been hanging around Christmas for a long time now, but you don't know my story very well. In fact, sometimes I kind of feel like the father of the bride at a wedding, right? Like I got to pay for the whole thing, but nobody notices me or cares about me. That's kind of how I felt like over time being at the first Christmas. Now, something you need to know about me is I'm a carpenter. I like to plan everything. I like to measure twice, cut once, and all of that. And so I like when things go according to plan. And I want to tell you that first Christmas, it seemed like nothing was going according to plan. My world had been flipped upside down. I just kind of want to tell you about that this morning. So where to start in my story? I guess my small claim to fame is that I happen to be a descendant of David, Israel's greatest king. That's really not a whole lot to boast about. David lived 1,000 years before I came along. And by the time that I was born, there were thousands of people who had been descended from the great King David. There were a lot of little Davids running around. Every mother was naming their little son David. But I was proud of it anyway. Of course, David had long died, and our kingdom had since lost its glory. And you know the story, if you've been keeping up with the reading, that we were living by this time in sort of a spiritual and a moral darkness. In fact, there were times when things seemed so dark, we didn't even know if God was even still there or if God was listening to us. We certainly didn't know what God was doing. 400 years since we'd heard from a prophet of God, and nothing since that time. I grew up in a little town of Bethlehem, about 7 miles south of the capital city of Jerusalem, and it was really hard to make a living there. So when I was a young man, I went up north to the hill country near the Lake of Galilee and settled in a town by the name of Nazareth. Now, I didn't go to Nazareth because it was some big, great metropolis city. No. In fact, it was really kind of a joke. I went there, though, because there were people, and people needed the things that I made. And so I went there to work my trade. You see, again, I'm a carpenter. And I guess that tells you something about me. Carpenters are practical people who plan their work and work their plan, and we're not poets, we're not philosophers, we're not good at sort of abstract thinking. We like things that you can handle and measure and cut and saw. And that's why I love being a carpenter. I love working with wood because, you know, there's a kind of spirit to wood. Cedar, pine, oak, they all sort of have their own spirit, so to speak. And wood's an honest thing. Wood has integrity. And I like that in wood. I like wood because it has integrity. But I don't tell you, I like that about people as well. So there I was living in Nazareth, and times were pretty good for me in Nazareth. And I'll tell you what was especially good was when I met a girl named Mary. Mary's about 15 and a half when I met her, and actually she really wasn't a girl. She was really a woman, and she was a wonderful woman. And before long, we were betrothed to be married. Now, betrothal is kind of a weird word. You guys probably don't use it a whole lot, but it's sort of like your engagement, except it's a whole lot more serious. It's kind of like you're married without being together intimately or without living together. And it's such a serious commitment that if you want to break off this betrothal or this period of engagement, you had to actually get a divorce certificate. And so this period would last maybe a year or more. And during this year of betrothal, families would get to know each other, and they would work out a dowry. And it's really just kind of a nice time. But I want to tell you, in that year period, I just came to love Mary more and more each day. I can't even really describe it, but there were times when she would be talking or she'd be laughing, and her eyes would just dance with joy. It was just so amazing to be with her. But she was a woman of character. She had as much character as the pillars of the temple. She was solid through and through. Not only that, though, she was thoughtful, and she was deep, and she pondered life, and she wrote songs, and some of her songs that she wrote were absolutely magnificent. But that period of betrothal was important for me because that's the time in that year that I planned, and I dreamed, and I kind of, in my mind anyway, I thought of the house that I would build for Mary and how we would live there. And I thought about the kids that we would have and how we would raise them in this house. And I dreamt of our life to come and how we would just sort of grow old together. It was just a wonderful time. It's strange, though, how quickly, isn't it? Things can change. Almost overnight, dreams can turn into nightmares, and your best plans can be shattered. That happened with me, so that's kind of my part of the story. That's why I want to share it with you, because even though I didn't know it at the time, there was a lot more going on than what I could see immediately. I believe you're calling this the upper story, where there are times when God is doing things in the upper realm that we can't see and we can't really understand sometimes. And so we kind of wonder, God, what are you doing? What's going on? And that's certainly what I was feeling during this time. I had noticed that Mary had become quite withdrawn. And I kept asking her, what's wrong? And only thing she said was, I just can't talk about it, Joseph. I can't talk about it. And so after a little bit of time, I had to go up to Capernaum to do some work. And while I was up there, all I could do was think about what in the world was wrong with her. And I wondered about her silence. I wondered if I had done something to offend her, if I had made her upset about something, or maybe I'd done something to cause her parents to have second thoughts about letting me marry her, or I thought maybe they found something at the temple that indicated we couldn't be married, like we were too closely related or something. They keep all those records at the temple. But the problem was I didn't know. By the time I left Capernaum and got back to Nazareth, I want to tell you, I was beside myself. So finally, I just got in her face and I said, Mary, you've got to tell me what's wrong. You can't shut me out of your life like this. I wish I wouldn't have said that because I wasn't ready for her answer. She looked at me with a straight face and she said, Joseph, I'm pregnant. And then she began to weep. And she always knew how I hated when she cried. But of all the things that had been in my mind that might have been the problem with her, that thought never occurred to me. Pregnant? I hadn't been with her. I knew that I hadn't been with her, and if not me, who? And how could she let this happen? And how could it happen without my knowing, without her parents knowing? And not only how, but why? Why would she do that? We had everything going. We had love, and we had trust, and we had plans, and we had hopes, and we had dreams. And I asked her, why? Again, I didn't like the answer. She answered me. Her explanation was actually more of a slap in the face than the actual event itself, because she told me that an angel, all right, an angel had appeared to her, a 16-year-old girl in a fifth-rate little village, that she was going to be the mother of Israel's long-awaited Messiah. And then she told me something else. She said that she told me she was still a virgin, that it was the Spirit of God who had come upon her. Well, it was another thing to tell me that she was pregnant, but it was another thing to just treat me like an absolute fool. That the Holy Spirit had planted this baby in her womb. I was furious. To tell me a story like that, in my mind, almost really bordered on blasphemy. And like I said, we hadn't heard a word from God in 400 years. 400 years of silence, and now she wants me to believe that God is going to reestablish communication with her, a 16-year-old girl. I couldn't believe it. I wouldn't believe it. And so my initial reaction was to lash out at her. I wanted to hurt her like she was hurting me. Like back in the old law, the Old Testament, as you call it, it actually said that if a woman was caught in adultery or was found to be in adultery, she could be stoned to death. And I want to tell you, I understood that law. Some of the laws in the books of Moses kind of made me scratch my head, but I understood now in that time. I got that law. And even though we didn't practice that really anymore, I wanted somehow to get back at her. I wanted somehow to inflict all the pain on her that she had inflicted on me, because of what she'd done to my faith, what she had done to my dreams, what she had done to my reputation. Again, I want you to understand, I was a righteous man. I was known to be that. I was known to be a righteous man. In other words, I tried my best to live according to the scriptures, not perfectly, but I did my best, and I had a reputation in the community, and as soon as people saw that Mary was pregnant, they would assume I was the father, that my reputation would be destroyed. Nobody would want to do business with me. Nobody would trust me to make their tables and their chairs or their yoke for their oxen. She had taken that away from me, and I was furious. So I was going to make it public. I was going to go before the elders at the gate of the city and sever this relationship, explain that I was not responsible, that Mary had been unfaithful to me, that she was an adulteress. I was going to set the record straight. I couldn't do it. I loved Mary. I loved Mary. Even though my trust was shattered, even though I felt I couldn't marry her, I could not expose her to that public shame. So I decided that I would kind of do things quietly. I would make up some kind of a story and just divorce her quietly. And she knew because of the stories that would be told and all of the caustic gossip of the people, she knew that she had to leave. And so she decided she would go south to the area of Hebron where her cousin Elizabeth and her husband Zachariah lived. And there they would give her a home. They would give her a place to stay. They would protect her. Elizabeth had pretty much been like a mother to Mary, really. And so just like that, Mary was gone out of my life. But she was never out of my mind. I remember one day I was working and I remembered something from the prophets. It's a strange prophet. I think you talked about his story maybe a few weeks ago, but a strange prophet named Hosea. And how the Lord had told Hosea to go marry this lady named Gomer. Gomer for a girl was not popular back then, as I'm sure it's not now, but that was the name, right? And so God told Hosea to go marry Gomer. Actually, she wasn't a lady. She was actually a prostitute is what she was. And God told Hosea to go marry this lady Gomer, and so he did that. Well, after a little bit of time, I remembered the story goes that Gomer left Hosea, went back to her old life. And once again, God went to Hosea and said, you need to go get her. You need to go get her. You need to bring her back. You need to stay faithful to her. And it was to be a reminder and a lesson of God's faithfulness to his people, even though they were unfaithful to him. And I wondered about that story. Was that what God was trying to communicate to me? Was Hosea's story becoming my story? I didn't know. I didn't know, but honestly, I was just kind of an absolute mess at that time. I would work at my bench, but I couldn't pay attention to what I was doing. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. But one night I had a dream. I dreamt that I was walking through darkness, and up ahead there was this blazing immense light. And in the center of this light, I dreamt that there was an angel. There was an angel. I was absolutely terrified. The angel told me not to be afraid. The angel said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary to be your wife, because this child she bears is of the Holy Spirit, and you'll call him Jesus, because he will save people from their sins. Well, I awoke from that dream or that vision or trance or whatever it was, I don't know. But when I awoke from that dream, I was elated. I had a messenger from heaven, and I realized that Mary had told me the truth. That God, through that angel, revealed to me that there was a new plan. That there was a new plan, and I was to be a part of it. That the time had finally come, that the long-awaited Messiah was going to be born, and I was going to be involved with that. And so I was filled with such joy that as soon as I could, I went down to Hebron, and I told Elizabeth and Zachariah what I'd heard, what I'd seen, and then I apologized to Mary for doubting her word. And then I took her back to Nazareth, and as soon as I could, we were married. I made her my wife. But listen, I swear to you, in all of that time, and all of that time until Jesus was born, I never touched her. We never, ever slept together before Jesus was born. There's a wise man, one of our kings. You may have studied him, named Solomon. And Solomon was known to be one of the wisest men available. But he said that He said that a man has to know in his life that there are certain times in life. He said there's a time for everything, a season for every activity under the sun, and that we need to know what time or what season it is in our life. And so from that time forward, I knew that our lives would never be the same. But I also thought that if this was of God, if God was truly behind this, that everything would go, now it would go according to plan. Everything would just be smooth sailing. Well, I told you, I'm a carpenter. I'm not much of a theologian. Can't imagine how wrong I was. During Mary's 9th month, Caesar Augustus sent out a decree. He wanted to have a census so people could be taxed. So that meant that we all had to go to our hometown. So I understand that today the census guy comes to your house. Well, Caesar Augustus had never thought of that. We had to travel and go to the place where we were born so that they could count how many of us were. And so I had a decision to make. I knew that I had to make that trip from Nazareth back to Bethlehem, but I wondered, should I take Mary? But then I thought of the criticism and the gossip and all the things that were going on still, and I couldn't leave Mary to face all of that by herself. So we made the trip back, 3 days, hard journey. Now, I knew that if we could just get to Bethlehem, there'd be people there who would take us in, who would provide for us. I knew that there were relatives that would love us and take us in. And again, a great plan. But what I didn't anticipate was the crazy crowd that would be there because of the census. We got to Bethlehem a little later than everybody else. The relatives had taken in more people than they could handle. And not only that, but the trip had begun Mary's birthing pains, and so I searched desperately for lodging. I looked everywhere. There was a caravan of poor people that stayed on the edge of town. I thought about going out there, but they didn't have any room, and I was so desperate. Finally, I found the only place I could, a cave out on the edge of town, a place where a farmer kept his cattle. At least it was out of the elements. So there, the chosen one of God, Mary, lays on straw because there's nowhere else. No bed, no boards, there's nothing. So I lit a fire to keep us warm, and when the baby came, I didn't know what to do. Again, I'm a carpenter. I didn't know what to do. Mary, she had to be both midwife and mother, but somehow that child was born, and we named him Jesus. I cut the cord, I cleaned the baby as best I could, I wrapped him in some cloths, and I put him in a manger because the only other place to lay him would have been on the filth of that cavern floor. But Jesus was born. But I want to tell you, even then, I had all kinds of questions. All kinds of questions. I remember asking God, if this wife of mine is so highly favored, like if this is of you, God, how could this be? Born in a cave, like not exactly a storybook birth. Like, how do you explain the dirt and the cattle and the loneliness? I mean, nobody came from Jerusalem to celebrate the birth of the Messiah. Nobody even really paid much of attention. Nobody came from Bethlehem. We were completely alone, just us and a few animals standing around. Well, there were some shepherds, some country bumpkins who came in and smelled of wineskins about them. But they said that an angel out on the hillside came to them and told them about our baby boy. But we felt the loneliness. Mary and I, we weren't stone. We weren't some inanimate statuettes in a nativity scene. We were flesh and blood people. And we felt in that moment so absolutely alone. After all of the hubbub of the census had subsided, we decided to stay in Bethlehem. We weren't about to go back to Nazareth and all of the gossip, and so I rented a house. I took whatever jobs I could. And after we were there almost a year or more, we had some weird visitors, some astrologers from beyond the rising sun, what you would call today Iran, and they said that they had seen a star. And that they followed this star, and they had come to Jerusalem, and they were searching for a newborn king. And so they went to our half-breed King Herod, and they asked him about the one who had been born King of the Jews. And then they came further south to Bethlehem. And so here was our boy Jesus, like barely a toddler. And these weird pagan dignitaries come in, and when they saw him, they fell down on their knees and they worshiped him. Now listen, we all think that our kids are special, don't we? But even you this would be surprising to you if somebody bowed down and worshiped your child. Not only that, but they brought gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh and expensive gifts. And then just as quickly as they came, they just left. But I want to tell you, we needed those gifts. In fact, a short time after that, I was warned in another dream not to take Mary home, but to take her and the child and go to Egypt, that it wasn't safe where we were. And so it hadn't been for that gold and frankincense and perfume, and that we wouldn't have been able to live in Egypt because we didn't have any money. And we were aliens. We were strangers. They didn't have any time in Egypt for poor Jewish carpenters. And so I saw that gold as a provision straight from the hand of God. And that just kind of helped me to settle me that God maybe is in the plan of this. After a little while, Herod died, and so we felt it was safe to go back. I wanted to settle in Bethlehem because we had relatives and all, but there was still political unrest, and God had actually directed us to go back to Nazareth. And so again, here he is, the creator of the entire universe, and he sends us back to Nazareth, right? With all of the gossip and the raised eyebrows and the dirty jokes and the accusations, and I don't know why it is, and I hope it's not that way today, but sometimes God's people can be some of the cruelest people there are. But that's where we went. And I want to tell you, I had all kinds of questions. Even still, I used to think when I was young, if I could just once in my life see an angel or have a direct communication from God, then that would take away any doubt I ever had. I would always believe. And then I saw that angel. And the angel, whether it was a dream or vision, I still don't know, but it was real and vivid to me. And there were times I wondered, is it possible that I just so wanted Mary to be who I thought she was, that I had just conjured up this angel, that it was just a figment of my imagination? Like sometimes I wondered that. And sometimes I wasn't sure. And Jesus, Savior of the world, come on. He really didn't seem much like a Savior of the world. He really didn't seem, when he was growing up, all that different from all the other boys. He was good. He was an obedient boy. But when we were back in Nazareth, he came to the table along with the other children. He didn't float to the table. He didn't perform any miracles. When he fell on the streets of Nazareth, he skinned his knee. He bled, just like any of us. And there were times when I held him in my lap and I told him stories, and he would fall asleep just like the rest of the kids. He wasn't that different. But there were some reminders of maybe something different was going on. You kind of saw it on the video. Let me sort of give you the inside story on how this unfolded. He was about 12 or so, I guess, and we went down to Jerusalem. It was a feast day, a holiday. All the relatives, all the friends, we all caravaned together to go to Jerusalem. It's a great time. But on the way back, we had gone about a day's journey, and we lost him. We didn't know where he was. We thought he was with the relatives in another part of the caravan. We went and asked them. They hadn't seen him. Here I am, Joe Davidson. I had lost the Son of God. I didn't know what to do. We panicked. We traced our steps. We went back. We climbed back up that mountain, got to Jerusalem, and here he was talking to the leaders of the people, asking them questions, but more crazy than that, they were asking him questions, and he was answering them. I said, son, you've driven us crazy. Your mother's frantic. We didn't know where you were. How could you do this to us? And this is kind of the first real time that I knew, okay, something's different here. He said, just as calm as can be, well, don't you know I have to be about my Father's business? Let me tell you, that may sound good in church or on a video, but I didn't know what to do with that from a 12-year-old kid, right? And my point is that he wasn't that much different, but he was different. And because of that, I wondered. And I sometimes had doubts. I could never express my doubts to Mary. I could never let her know that I didn't have enough faith to shout down all the questions that I had. I wasn't Jesus' biological father. She knew that. I knew that. Everybody in the town knew that. And I just wrestled with how could this all be? And I had questions. But I'll tell you what I also had. I had a small part of the prophets that 800 years before I came along, a prophet named Isaiah, he said that a virgin would conceive and have a son, and they would call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And I had that prophecy, and there were a couple others like it, but I held on to those little tiny pieces of scripture for dear faith, because sometimes I really felt that's all I really had to hang on to. Now, some of you here, you have a faith like Mary's, and it's obedient, it's strong, it's rich, it's unwavering, and you are God's special people. But some of you, I think probably most of you, are a little bit more like me. You're practical. You live in a world of cause and effect. You like things that you can touch and feel and measure, and you find it hard to believe. Sometimes you find it hard to believe. You know, I think that faith has its moods. And some of you understand that. Some of you are like me in that you believe your doubts at times and you doubt your beliefs. And sometimes maybe you wonder if you even believe at all. It's almost so hard to believe. I get that. But from somebody who has kind of seen both sides of this, all I can tell you is that back then, before I had all of the answers and I faced those questions, I just decided that it made more sense, even more practical sense and logical sense, to come down on the side of faith. I just faithed it through. Or like that book of Hebrews says that without faith it's impossible to please God. I wanted to please God in that time. And so I just did my best to faith it through in spite of my questions, in spite of my hurt, in spite of my fear. I just knew the only option I had was to trust in God. And it turned out that trust and faith was well placed because God had a plan. God always has a plan. And I trusted in that story that God was writing, that he was writing through me. I trusted even when I didn't feel like trusting. It kind of reminds me, I was dead and gone by this time, but there was a time when Jesus was ministering and he encountered this man, and this man talked about how he was having a hard time believing, and Jesus said, well, you need to believe, you need to have faith. And the man said, I do believe, but help me with my unbelief. And I like that because sometimes that's what it is. But God uses that. And all I wanted to do was tell you that I, Joe Davidson, I put my thumbprint on Jesus Christ. I taught him to be a carpenter, and he was a good one. He would make yoke for people's oxen, and they said that his yoke was the easiest there was around. People called him the carpenter. That's what I taught him. He was the carpenter. And I put my thumbprint on his life. But you know what else? Because he was the one who would take away the sins of the world, because he was the Savior. Not only did I put my thumbprint on his life, but he put his thumbprint on my soul. But it wasn't easy. It's never easy. I just knew that when God wanted me to do something, I just did it. And I had faith enough for that. I could at least do that. One more step, one step in front of the next one. Anyway, that's my story. I thought I'd share it with you. You're gonna celebrate Christmas. You're gonna worship again the birth of Jesus, and you ought to. And I just want you to know that when you celebrate Christmas, like whether it's in June or December or whenever, Like, you need to understand that I had a part in that. You need to understand the reason that you celebrate that blessed time of year. That when the time had fully come, God put his plan into action, and sent his son into the world so that the world could be saved through him. And again, I, Joseph Davidson, I had something to do with that. A carpenter who sometimes believed his doubts and doubted his beliefs, but who faithed it through. And sometimes that's just the best that we can do. Like I said, I'm not the main character in the story. But when you do celebrate Christmas, you might remember that when God wanted somebody to take care of his boy, to raise him, he chose Joe Davidson, a carpenter who believed the best he could. And because I guess the one thing that I would tell you is this, that as you're reading through the rest of the story, as you're reading through the rest of God's story, understand that God always keeps his promises. The path isn't always clear. We always don't understand what's going on. Sometimes in this world we come to understand, but there are times when we may not understand until we get home to heaven. And yet God is always working his plan. Those 400 years before the angels appeared, God wasn't silent. God wasn't doing nothing. He was planning and preparing for just the right time. He always keeps his promises. Trust me, as one who's seen the upper story as well, who has walked with you down here in the lower story, that God always keeps his promises. But I want to tell you this, and know this without a doubt, that the best part of the story is the fact that it's yet to come. It's yet to come. As wonderful as it was when Jesus was born, that is not the best part of the story. The best part of the story is when he comes again, not as a tiny baby in a manger, but when he comes as the Lion of Judah, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And when he comes, every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ, my son, God's son, that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So if you're having a hard time hanging on, if you're having a hard time believing, if you're sometimes believing your doubts and doubting your beliefs, I just want to encourage you to hang on. Hang on, because I promise you, the best is yet to come, and it will come. He is coming again. He is coming again.